Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most important preparation guides for PwC Acceleration Center campus and off-campus interviews. These may be expected questions, which are gathered using web search and our personal database, so you can use this as a preparation material. But our suggestion is to go with other topics as well from our channel playlist. You can check timestamps in the description for the questions and jump to any particular question you want. Let's begin. How would you approach auditing a multinational client where key processes are transitioned to an acceleration center team? Sample answer. I begin by understanding the scope of work transitioned to the acceleration center, including which processes are executed offshore and which remain with onshore teams. Then I map handoffs, dependencies, and controls owned by each team. I also evaluate whether documentation, evidence storage, and communication protocols are consistent across locations. Finally, I maintain continuous alignment with onshore teams to avoid duplication or gaps. Points to be included in answer. Understand transition scope. Map handoffs and controls. Check documentation consistency. Align regularly with onshore. Ending. What steps would you take to validate completeness of large transactional datasets provided by offshore clients? Sample answer. I first perform control total checks, such as row counts, totals, and hash totals. Then, I reconcile dataset totals with the general ledger to ensure completeness. I test samples to verify the accuracy of fields. If the population is extremely large, I validate through system extracts and perform automated completeness checks. Points to be included in answer. Perform control totals. Reconcile with GL. Validate fields. Use system-driven extractions. A PwC US or UK team sends unclear audit instructions. How do you ensure correct execution? Sample answer. I reach out promptly for clarification, summarizing my understanding to avoid misinterpretation. I ask for examples or templates where possible. Once instructions are clear, I document the agreed scope to avoid future confusion. Good communication prevents rework and delays. Points to be included in answer. Ask for clarity early. Confirm understanding. Request examples. Document final scope. How do you perform walkthroughs for processes executed entirely through shared service centers? Sample answer. I begin by understanding the process flow using documented SOPs. Then I schedule walkthroughs with process owners at the shared service center and observe how transactions move through the system. I review screenshots, system logs, and control evidence. Walkthroughs help confirm both design and implementation of controls. Points to be included in answer. Review SOPs. Observe end-to-end flow. Validate with system logs. Confirm design and implementation. What procedures do you follow to audit complex revenue streams for a global technology client? Sample answer. I break the revenue into buckets like subscription, licensing, usage-based fees, and professional services. Then, I identify performance obligations and test transaction price allocation. I also review system-driven billing, cutoff, and deferred revenue schedules. Technology clients depend heavily on automated systems, so IT controls are crucial. Points to be included in answer. Understand revenue buckets. Test performance obligations. Review billing systems. Validate deferred revenue. You notice inconsistent mapping of trial balance accounts across entities. What is your approach? Sample answer. I compare mappings between entities and reconcile them with the global chart of accounts. Then, I identify which mappings are incorrect and discuss them with onshore teams. I assess whether incorrect mapping affects consolidation. If needed, I request revised TB uploads. Points to be included in answer. Compare mappings, identify incorrect classifications, assess consolidation impact, request updated TB, How do you ensure quality and consistency in multi-component audits across time zones? Sample answer. I use standardized templates, checklists, and documentation formats. Daily coordination calls help align expectations. I also review key work papers early to prevent rework. Time zone differences require disciplined communication and clear handovers. Points to be included in answer. Standard templates, daily sync-ups, early reviews, strong handovers. What checks would you perform to test design and operating effectiveness of automated controls? Sample answer. I review configuration settings, test logic using sample transactions, and verify whether controls trigger automatically. I also check exception logs and change management reports. For operating effectiveness, I evaluate evidence that controls worked consistently throughout the period. Points to be included in answer. Review configuration, test logic, check exception logs, validate consistency. End. You detect unusual patterns during data analytics. How would you investigate further? Sample answer. I drill down into the flagged transactions and verify supporting documents. I check for timing issues, round number patterns, or unusual users posting entries. If concerns persist, I expand the sample size and discuss with senior team members. Points to be included in answer. Drill down, validate with evidence, expand sample, escalate if needed. How would you review audit evidence prepared by offshore teams for sufficiency and appropriateness? Sample answer. I check whether evidence supports the assertion being tested. Then, I review quality of documentation, cross-references, and conclusions. If evidence is weak, I provide clear feedback and request rework. Consistency is key in global audits. Points to be included in answer. Check relevance, review quality, provide feedback, ensure consistency. What procedures do you perform to validate lease accounting under ASC 842 or IFRS 16? Sample answer. I identify all lease contracts, including embedded leases. Then I verify lease terms, discount rates, and ROU asset calculations. I test completeness by reviewing vendor spends and expense accounts. I also check remeasurements and disclosures. Points to be included in answer. Identify all leases, validate calculations, test completeness, review disclosures. The component team disagrees with your proposed audit adjustments. What do you do? Sample answer. I explain the basis for the adjustment with supporting evidence. If disagreement continues, I involve senior team members and consult technical specialists. The goal is to reach a conclusion aligned with auditing standards, not personal preference. Points to be included in answer. Present evidence, discuss calmly, involve seniors, align with standards. How do you audit fair value measurements involving Level 3 inputs? Sample answer. I start by understanding the valuation model and assumptions like discount rate, growth rate, and market comparables. I compare assumptions with external data where possible. For highly subjective inputs, I involve valuation specialists. Level 3 items require strong challenge and documentation. Points to be included in answer. Understand model. Test assumptions. Use external benchmarks. Involve specialists. What steps would you take to assess management's assumptions in goodwill impairment testing? Sample answer. I evaluate future cash flow forecasts, discount rates, and long-term growth assumptions. I compare these with industry norms and past performance. I run sensitivity tests to see if small changes lead to impairment. If assumptions appear optimistic, I challenge them with evidence. Points to be included in answer. Review forecasts, validate discount rates, perform sensitivity analysis, challenge unrealistic assumptions. You identify multiple period-end journal entries. How would you test them? Sample answer. I analyze timing, user access, and purpose of each entry. I review supporting documentation and authorization. I check for round numbers or unusual accounts. Period-end journals are high risk, so I apply professional skepticism. Points to be included in answer: analyze timing and users, trace support, check for unusual patterns, apply skepticism. How do you evaluate the effectiveness of ITGCs in hybrid cloud environments? Sample answer: I test access controls, password policies, and change management across both cloud and on-premise systems. I review SOC reports for cloud components. I also test backup processes and incident management. Hybrid setups require integrated testing. Points to be included in answer: test access and change controls, review SOC reports, validate backups, test incident management. What checks do you perform to audit intercompany transactions across geographies? Sample answer: I reconcile balances between counterparties, test foreign exchange translations, verify pricing policies, and investigate reconciling items. Intercompany accounts must eliminate correctly in consolidation. Points to be included in answer: match balances, check FX rates, test pricing policies, review eliminations. Supporting documents from clients seem incomplete. How do you address this with onshore teams? Sample answer: I compile a clear list of missing items and explain how it affects audit conclusions. I share examples of acceptable evidence. I request onshore support to coordinate with the client. Transparency prevents delays. Points to be included in answer: list missing documents, explain impact, provide examples, coordinate with onshore. How do you test operating effectiveness of controls in a shared services environment? Sample answer: I obtain evidence of controls performed, such as approvals, checklists, and system logs. I test samples across periods to confirm consistency. I also review escalation mechanisms for exceptions. Shared services rely heavily on standardized controls. Points to be included in answer: test evidence, across periods, check escalation, validate standardization. What procedures verify consolidation adjustments for a global group? Sample answer: I review mapping rules, elimination entries, and foreign currency translations. I test adjustments like NCI, goodwill, and intercompany eliminations. I reconcile consolidation output with subsidiary reports. Points to be included in answer: review mapping logic, test eliminations, validate adjustments, reconcile data. You notice discrepancies between subledger data and GL balances. How do you proceed? Sample answer: I perform a reconciliation to isolate differences. I analyze aging and investigate incomplete postings or timing differences. Material differences require escalation to onshore teams. Points to be included in answer: reconcile SL to GL, identify causes, investigate unresolved items, escalate material gaps. How do you validate tax provisions and uncertain tax positions for multinational clients? Sample answer: I review tax computations for each jurisdiction, test temporary differences, and verify documentation supporting uncertain tax positions. I also check alignment with transfer pricing documentation and evaluate disclosures. Points to be included in answer: review computations, test differences, validate UTP support, check disclosures. What is your approach to auditing complex financial instruments like swaps and forward contracts? Sample answer: I review contract terms, valuation methods, and key inputs like interest and FX rates. I compare valuations with independent pricing sources. I also verify hedge documentation and effectiveness tests. Points to be included in answer: understand terms, validate valuation, Check independent prices. Review hedge documents. You identify potential override issues during controls testing. How do you escalate? Sample answer. I document the evidence, assess whether misstatements occurred, and escalate to senior team members. Override risk is serious, so I may increase substantive testing and inform onshore teams immediately. Points to be included in answer. Document issues. Assess misstatements. Escalate. Increase testing. End. How do you test completeness of revenue in subscription-based businesses? Sample answer. I review customer contracts, billing schedules, and activation logs. I reconcile system data, be financial records. I analyze renewal rates, cancellations, and usage metrics. Subscription revenue depends heavily on system accuracy, so IT controls are key. Points to be included in answer. Review contracts, check billing, reconcile logs, test renewals and cancellations. What would be your approach to audit pension and employee benefit obligations? Sample answer. I start by reviewing actuarial valuation reports to understand the assumptions used, such as discount rates, mortality rates, and salary escalation. Then I test the completeness and accuracy of employee census data provided to actuaries. I reconcile actuarial results with the general ledger and verify disclosures under the applicable standards. If assumptions appear aggressive or inconsistent with market indicators, I challenge them. Points to be included in answer. Review actuarial assumptions. Test census data. Reconcile actuarial output. Challenge unrealistic inputs. Discon. Onshore teams request urgent work beyond agreed timelines. How do you manage prioritization? Sample answer. I assess the urgency and risk associated with the new request. Then I communicate capacity constraints clearly and suggest realistic timelines. If needed, I escalate the prioritization discussion to senior team members so that work is aligned with audit priorities. Transparency avoids delays and protects quality. Points to be included in answer. Assess risk and urgency. Communicate capacity. Agree revised timeline. Escalate if required. How do you audit vendor-related liabilities in a high transaction volume environment? Sample answer. I perform vendor reconciliations, test three-way match controls, and analyze aging reports. I review GRN-based accruals and check for unrecorded liabilities through post-period payments. High-volume environments depend heavily on system controls, so I validate automation as well. Points to be included in answer. Vendor reconciliation, test three-way match, check accruals, review post-period payments. What procedures do you follow to evaluate SOC reports from third-party service organizations? Sample answer. I review the SOC report's scope and control objectives. I check whether complementary user controls are implemented by the client. I evaluate any exceptions reported and assess whether additional testing is needed. SOC reports help determine reliance on outsourced processes. Points to be included in answer. Review SOC scope, validate user controls, evaluate exceptions, perform additional tests if needed. You find contradictory information between management representations and evidence. What next? Sample answer. I document the contradiction and discuss it with management to understand the reason. If the explanation is insufficient, I expand testing to determine whether misstatements exist. I also escalate to senior audit members. Management representations cannot override factual evidence. Points to be included in answer. Document contradiction, seek explanation, expand testing, escalate if needed. How do you audit multi-location fixed assets and depreciation calculations? Sample answer. I obtain location-wise fixed asset registers and reconcile them with the ledger. I perform physical verification on a sample basis for high-value or high-risk locations. I test additions, disposals, useful lives, and depreciation methods. Multi-location audits require strong coordination and consistency. Points to be included in answer: reconcile registers, perform physical checks, test additions and disposals, validate depreciation. US. What steps do you take to validate expected credit loss (ECL) models for financial clients? Sample answer: I examine the model's structure, including segmentation, probability of default, loss given default, and exposure calculations. I test assumptions against historical loss trends and market data. I perform sensitivity analysis to assess how changes impact provisions. Due to high judgment, I often involve risk specialists. Points to be included in answer: understand model structure, test PD, LGD, EAD, compare with history, use sensitivity analysis. You identify an error affecting several entities in consolidation. How do you communicate it? Sample answer: I quantify the total impact and explain how the error affects group financials. I prepare a clear summary and share it with the onshore consolidation team. I also recommend correction and retesting of affected entities. Communication must be timely to avoid delays. Points to be included in answer: quantify impact, share clear summary, recommend correction, coordinate across entities. How do you audit cash flow statements prepared under IFRS or US GAAP? Sample answer: I reconcile cash flow items with ledger movements and bank statements. I verify classification rules, which differ slightly between IFRS and US GAAP. I test adjustments such as depreciation, working capital movements, and interest paid or received. I also check mathematical accuracy. Points to be included in answer: reconcile with ledger and bank, verify classification, test adjustments, ensure accuracy. What procedures do you perform to check accuracy of foreign currency translations? Sample answer: I verify appropriate exchange rates, closing, average, or historical, where applicable. I test translation of monetary and non-monetary items. I review CTA movement in equity and reconcile translation differences with subsidiary data. Translation must follow Ind AS 21, IFRS, or US GAAP, depending on context. Points to be included in answer: verify exchange rates, test translation rules, review CTA movement, reconcile subsidiary data. End. A component auditor's work paper quality seems weak. How do you ensure compliance with audit standards? Sample answer: I review their work papers for sufficiency, documentation quality, and evidence support. I request clarifications or additional work if needed. If gaps persist, I escalate to group audit leaders. Group engagements require uniform quality across all component teams. Points to be included in answer: review work paper quality, request clarifications, ask for additional work, escalate if required. How do you evaluate sustainability and ESG disclosures during audit? Sample answer: I understand the ESG framework used, such as GRI or SASB. Then I validate data sources like energy consumption, emissions, or social metrics. I test calculations and link narrative disclosures to underlying evidence. ESG audits focus heavily on data traceability and consistency. Points to be included in answer: understand framework, validate data sources, test calculations, link narrative with evidence. What steps would you take to audit clients undergoing digital transformation or ERP migration? Sample answer: I assess project governance, change management, and data migration testing. I review reconciliation between old and new systems. I test controls post-migration, especially around access, configuration, and automated processes. Digital transformation introduces significant audit risks, so planning is critical. Points to be included in answer: review governance, validate data migration, test post-migration controls, assess risks early. End. You discover late adjustments that significantly alter financial results. What is your response? Simple answer: I investigate the nature and reason for the adjustments. I verify supporting documents and authorization. Late entries carry override risk, so I test them thoroughly. If concerns exist, I escalate to seniors and consider impact on the audit opinion. Points to be included and answer: investigate purpose, trace support, assess override risk, escalate. How do you analyze variances during analytics for seasonally impacted businesses? Sample answer: I build expectations using seasonal patterns from prior years. I compare month-on-month and year-on-year trends. I investigate variances that fall outside normal seasonal ranges. Seasonality requires more refined analytical models. Points to be included in answer: use seasonal trends, compare patterns, identify outliers, build refined expectations. What checks do you perform to confirm accuracy of provisions and contingent liabilities? Sample answer: I review legal letters, board minutes, and management assessments. I test assumptions and check whether provisions meet recognition criteria. For contingencies, I ensure appropriate disclosure. I also compare movements with prior periods to spot unusual behavior. Points to be included in answer: review legal input, test assumptions, check criteria, analyze trends. Data provided for analytics does not tie back to TB. How do you correct this? Sample answer: I perform reconciliation to identify missing or duplicated items. I request fresh extracts directly from systems. I also document the issue and inform onshore teams to avoid reliance on incorrect data. Ensuring correct population is essential for analytics. Points to be included in answer: reconcile population, request new extracts, document issue, inform onshore. How would you audit companies with heavy outsourcing models and shared services? Sample answer: I review process maps and understand which tasks are handled by the outsourcing partner. I test controls at both the service provider and client oversight level. I review SOC reports, SLAs, and escalation logs. Outsourcing increases dependency, so controls must be strong. Points to be included in answer: understand outsourced tasks, test provider and client controls, review SOC and SLAs, check oversight. What procedures do you perform to validate revenue cutoff during year-end testing? Sample answer: I review dispatch records, service completion reports, and contract terms around year-end. I trace sales entries to delivery evidence. I test credit notes issued after year-end to detect cutoff errors. Cutoff testing ensures revenue is not overstated. Points to be included in answer: test dispatch, validate evidence, review post-period credit notes, ensure proper timing. Onshore reviewers raise repeated review comments. How will you improve your work quality? Sample answer: I analyze prior review notes to identify recurring themes. I update my checklist and templates to avoid repeating the same mistakes. I ask for clarity if any comments seem unclear. Continuous learning improves efficiency and quality. Points to be included in answer: study review notes, update checklist, seek clarity, avoid repeat errors. How do you audit restructuring costs and one-time charges? Sample answer: I review restructuring plans, approvals, and supporting documents. I test whether the costs meet recognition criteria and whether they are not overstated. I analyze unusual entries and ensure correct disclosure in notes. Points to be included in answer: review plans, validate support, test recognition, ensure disclosure. End. What is your approach to auditing high-volume digital payment transactions? Sample answer: I reconcile gateway settlements with revenue reports, test automated controls, and run analytics to detect duplicates or anomalies. I also validate refunds, chargebacks, and dispute logs. Digital transactions require system-level assurance. Points to be included in answer: reconcile settlements, test automations, analyze patterns, review refunds. Internal audit reports show fraud indicators. How would you plan your procedures? Sample answer: I increase the risk level for affected areas, expand substantive testing, and perform targeted fraud procedures like journal testing and pattern analysis. I also involve seniors and maintain strict documentation. Fraud risk changes the overall audit strategy. Points to be included in answer: increase risk rating, expand testing, perform fraud-specific tests, escalate. How do you coordinate effectively with global PwC teams for consistent documentation? Sample answer: I use standard templates, align expectations during planning calls, and maintain frequent updates through email or meetings. I also share sample work papers to ensure consistent formatting. Early alignment avoids rework. Points to be included in answer: align early, use standard templates, keep regular updates, share sample work papers. You are working across multiple deadlines and geographies. How do you manage workload without compromising audit quality? Sample answer: I prioritize tasks based on risk and deadlines. I maintain a daily action tracker and communicate delays early. I block time for high-focus work and avoid multitasking during critical tasks. Audit quality depends on discipline, not speed. Points to be included in answer: prioritize by risk, use action trackers, communicate early, maintain focus. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience.